It is Friday, March 21st. This is Landon Blake, ruggedly handsome land surveyor extraordinaire, doing another truck brain dump on my drive into work today. I've been doing so many of these that I'm starting to fall behind on my podcast episodes that I listen to. But something came up yesterday in our shop, and I just wanted to talk about it a little bit. I actually decided I'm going to break this into two brain dumps. So on this brain dump, I want to answer the question, when do you have to go down into the canyon to look for the property corner monument? And I'll explain that. It seems like an odd question, but it actually makes a lot of sense and has some broader applications. I'm going to do a different brain dump, I hope, on the difference between a system of rules and a loose framework that allows for professional judgment, because I think that's important. And I think sometimes my team struggles to understand that. And so I want to talk about that separately. So it's related to this brain dump that we're going to do right now, because the brain dump that we're going to do right now touches on professional judgment and that there isn't always a rule. So the answer to that question, when do you go down to search for the property corner monument in the canyon? The answer to that question is it depends. So there isn't a black and white rule. It requires professional judgment. So let me give you the context so that you can understand the question that we're trying to answer. And then we can talk about the broader application a little bit. So we're doing a job up in the Sierra Nevada foothills of Central California, and the terrain is pretty rugged. If you ever spent time in that part of California, you can picture what I'm talking about. So we're up in the river canyon of the Tuolumne River. We're somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 feet. Lots of oak trees, lots of poison oak, lots of manzanita. The area is heavily overgrown because we haven't done any kind of fuel management work in California or let fires burn for 75 years. So in many places, it's so thick that you can't walk through the forest. You can crawl in some places, but you can't always walk. So I was out working on this particular line in this survey that we're doing. And there were a couple times when I had to get down and crawl on my hands and knees. So it's super thick. And some of it is very steep. So I was working on this particular line that we have. It's an aliquot line. I think it's a 16th line, east-west 16th line. It's section 3. That's the boundary between federal land and private land. One end on the, let's see, it would be the east end of the line. We have a monument. We actually have 2 monuments because it got double monumented, but we'll save that conversation for another day. So we have a monument. For the sake of simplicity, we'll say it's a single monument. And the map that shows that monument shows several other monuments in the section, and we have found at least a couple more of those. So basically, we have enough now to establish the location of the line from the record data. Now, on the west end of the line, there is no monument of record. So on no record map that we can find, is there any mention of a monument. There is a monument at the quarter corner to the north and the section corner to the south. But there's no monument at the end of this particular aliquot. And established on at least one survey as a calculated position, the west end of our line that I'm surveying. But if nobody's ever said that they set a monument. The challenge with this particular line, with this particular corner, is as you move west down the line, when you get about, I don't know, 400 feet or 500 feet from the west end of the line, drops straight down into the Tuolumne River. And when I say straight down, straight down. So the line intersects the river and at almost perpendicular angle here. So it literally goes straight down the wall of the canyon and it's extremely steep. So I would say the first 300 feet of that line is 2-to-1 or 3-to-1. So you go down 3 feet for every foot you go over. And then the last, let's call it 100 feet, maybe 50 feet, is almost a vertical drop off. So there's bedrock, exposed bedrock in the canyon walls. And there might be some places you can shimmy down, but it's extremely steep. I walked almost that whole line. And when I basically carved a tunnel through the brush down the canyon wall, and I got to within, I think, 50 feet horizontally of the corner location. And I basically got to a spot where there was a vertical drop and I couldn't get any farther. I was by myself. It was super wet and slippery and it was too dangerous for me. I decided not to do that. I think it was a good call. I think we can get down to that corner location. We probably have to not probably, we have to rope and harness in, and I got to go back with 3 guys at least, and I got to rappel down some of the rock. But I can see where the corner is. So it's on another little shelf or ledge. I don't know. It's 100 foot wide, or it's a 50 or 100 foot wide ledge, probably 100 foot wide shelf. That's about probably, let's call it 50 or 100 feet below where I had to stop. So the question that I was discussing with my field crew and my project surveyor yesterday was, do we need to go down and look for a monument at that corner? There's no monument in the record. And we can establish that position for record, and we can mark that line. So as part of our survey, we're going to mark that line. Now, per the contract, I got to set a sign and a post every 200 feet, and then I have to mark the actual corner location with the monument, and I have to sign them, put some signs around the monument, take some bearing trees. We're going to set a witness monument at the top of the cliff because I want you guys to understand, setting a monument partway down the canyon walls, really, number one, it's dangerous, it's not practical, and it doesn't help future surveyors anyway. Nobody else wants to go down the canyon wall either. That's why I'm going to set a witness monument at the top of the canyon wall. But so the question that came up yesterday in our shop is, do we really have to go down and look for that monument? It's a lot of work. It's dangerous and probably not anything there. The conversation I was having with my guys yesterday is, what's the rule, boss? Do we have to go look for that monument? So that's the specific situation that we're in this week at RH. The reason I wanted to do a brain dump on it is because the principles that we're going to talk about next apply in a much broader context. Is being asked here is, when do you have to look for a monument at the end of a line? Now, I'm not going to give you a set of black and white rules because that's not how boundary surveying works. You have legal principles and you have to use professional judgment. So let's work our way through this example. I've got some time here on my commute. Let's work through it. We are doing what we call a fully resolved boundary of this line. And we're not doing a fully resolved boundary of parcels on either side of the line, but we committed to fully resolving the location of this line on the ground. So that's important. Sometimes you're doing a record, what we call a record land net, or maybe you're doing a record boundary for planning purposes. I need to do another brain dump about record boundaries. So that might change the answer, folks. Right? If you're doing a record land net, then don't go down the canyon. Get a different monument that's more accessible to prepare your record land net. Yeah, but in this case, we need to know the actual fully resolved location of this line on the ground. So we're not doing a record land net. We're doing a resolved boundary survey of this line. And the next thing we have to ask ourselves, is there a monument? How likely is it that there's going to be a monument at the end of that line? In this case, probably not very likely. Now, occasionally on these forest surveys, I get to a corner where there's not any monument in the record and we find a monument. Actually, happens quite a bit. I don't think there's a 50% chance we're going to find a monument at the end of this line just because of the area that we're working in and the location. I'd say there's a 1 in 5 chance I shimmy down that rock wall and there is a monument at that corner. So 1 in 5 is not 0. That's 20%. So that's another question I have to ask. How likely is it to find a monument? Now, some surveyors will say, it doesn't matter if there's a monument there. If it's not a record, it doesn't count. And that's not the way I practice. If I find a monument and it looks like it's been accepted by the landowners and it's in good condition and I can tell it was placed as a result of a survey and it's fairly close to the calculated position, I'm going to hold it. We can talk about that in a different brain dump. The reasons why. But so it is important to me, even if the monument is not of record. But the other consideration that we need to make here is, so I've got 4 questions that I want to answer. The first thing you have to think about is, are you doing a fully resolved boundary? Yes or no? So we call that question number 1. Question number 2, how likely is it that you're going to find a monument in the corner? And if it's not of record, how might that change your boundary resolution? So that's question 2. And let me make a side note here. If you're doing a fully resolved boundary survey and there is a monument of record at the corner, you have to go find that corner. You have to go look for that monument. If you're doing a fully resolved boundary survey and there is a monument of record at that corner, you have to go find it. Unless the risk of death is 95%. Like that is not a shortcut boundary surveyors are allowed to take. Can't say, I didn't go look for that monument because it was too hard, or because it was uncomfortable, or because it was hot that day. You need to, and that monument marks a corner on your parcel. You need to go look for it. And that's not a black and white rule. But if you're not going to go look for that monument on a fully resolved boundary, you better have a really good reason. So what's a really good reason? I'll give an example. That monument you need to find is under 12 inches of pavement in the middle of a super busy intersection. And it would cause trying to uncover that monument in the pavement would pose a serious safety risk to your survey crew. And you can reestablish that monument from 2 nearby monuments with good record measurements. You know what? You might get a pass there. I'm not saying you do. Very situation specific. But that's an example where the risk to health and safety, both to yourself and to the public there, the driving public, might be too great and the uncertainty too low to justify the danger there. But those situations are pretty rare. And now, we're still on the side note, by the way. You can apply that principle to this situation I am. It is not zero risk to go down the canyon wall. There's some danger there. Probably not a monument. I can establish the calculated position, I think, within a foot or 2. You got to weigh all that out. So question 1 was, what type of boundary survey are you doing? You got to answer that question. Question 2, how likely are you to find a monument? at the corner. Is there a monument in the record? If there's not a monument in the record, how likely are you to find a monument not of record, and what is the impact of that? That's question 2. Question 3 is, what is the risk of not searching? So you have to assume there is a monument there, and then ask yourself, if I don't find that monument, what is the risk? How likely is it that there's a monument there that I'm not going to find? How likely is it that monument is not going to be calculated position? If there's a high probability of a monument being found and a high probability of it not being found in my calculated position, what are the potential consequences of that monument placing the surveyed boundary lines in a different location? If you're building a skyscraper or stadium, you better go down the canyon wall. You got to evaluate. That's a risk calculation. So that's question 3. What is the risk of not searching? Question 4, we talked about this a little bit. What is the risk or the cost of searching? So there's a couple types of risk there, right? Somebody could fall down the canyon wall and break their neck. That is not a risk that I take lightly, right? Somebody could die in the intersection. They could get hit by a car, or you could cause a car accident and somebody could get seriously injured. So that you have to consider that risk. What is the risk and look, part of this is cost too. It's not just health and safety. Like, my client is going to pay for my time to rappel down the canyon wall. And in almost all situations in a boundary survey, there is some trade-off there between cost and uncertainty. And so you have to ask yourself, put yourself in the client's shoes and say, would I want to pay the extra cost to eliminate this uncertainty? Because in almost all situations, we can get 95% certainty for a cost of X. Okay? To get 100% certainty is 5X or 10X. In other words, the last 5% of uncertainty cost a huge disproportionate amount of money to eliminate. So most people are good with 95%. Okay, this would be the fourth. See, this would be fifth. Sorry, number 5. Fifth question. What are the rules of the game that you're playing by? What do I mean by that? Are you working? Did you agree to work to a certain specification? If you're doing an ALTA survey, you got to go look for the monument. Almost certainly. Or have a really good reason why you didn't. If you're doing work for Caltrans, you're doing a right-of-way survey for Caltrans, you probably got to go look for that monument. That's going to be part of the spec that you're working under. If you're working for Region 5 Forest Service under their cadastral survey spec, you probably got to go look for that monument. You have to understand the rules of any specification that you're working. And then question 6, this is my last question, I think, is what did you agree to do? You have a scope of services. What did you agree to do in your scope? This is why scope of services are important. If you promised the client you were going to go look for every single property corner monument, no matter what, that's what you put in your scope. I don't think you should put that in your scope. But if that's what you put in your scope, if you've agreed to it, then you have to go do it, or you got to go back to your client and ask for an exception to your scope. There's probably a couple more questions we could ask, but those are the main ones. So let's go through them again. What type of boundary survey are you? What's the likelihood that there will be a monument at that corner? And even if there isn't a monument of record, what is the likelihood that you will find a monument not of record? And what might that do to your boundary resolution? Number 3, what is the risk or consequence of not searching for the monument? Number 4, what are the risks and costs of searching for the monument? Number 5, what rules of the game are you playing under? And number 6, what did you agree to do in your contract or your scope of services with the client? Got to answer all those questions. Now, here's the part that a lot of you, especially younger folks, are not going to. There isn't a lot of times a right or wrong answer. That's why land surveyors are licensed professionals. If we could just give everybody a set of black and white rules, you wouldn't need a license. We need a license because professional judgment is involved. So let's go back to the situation that I opened with. I am going to go down and search for that monument at the end of that line, the west end of that line in the canyon, because I'm going to sleep better at night if I do that. Now, there is a fair amount of risk to doing that to my health and safety, and there's some cost. That's why I am personally going to harness up and be the guy that shimmies down the rock wall. I'm not going to have my crew do that. I'm going to do that. That doesn't mean that's the right answer. If a different land surveyor said, I am not going to spend my client's money or take the risk to go down there, there's no monument or record, establish the calculated position accurately. I'm going to set a witness monument at the top and nobody ever has to go down that canyon wall. That's a good answer too. There's no wrong answer. In this particular case, there's no wrong answer. Both of those decisions, I think, are reasonable and defendable. And sometimes in boundary surveying, that happens. Now, I'll give you a scenario that might change my answer. Change the facts a little bit, and it'll change my answer. Let's say I didn't have a good record map that calculated the position of that corner. So maybe there's no map, or maybe I'm just going off like all I have is the original GLO plat, and they show bearings to the nearest degree only, and distances are to the nearest chain. All right. Now I might have to go down that canyon wall. So if you change the facts, you might change the answer. Again, I know a lot of you younger people aren't going to like this, but that still doesn't mean there's a right or wrong answer. It just means now you might have some different shades of gray now on each of those decisions. Part of being a good boundary surveyor is learning how to make those professional judgments, properly documenting them, explaining explaining the judgments you made in a technical report, and explaining the consequences of that to your client. A lot of that professional judgment just comes with experience. So professional judgment is involved in a lot of boundary surveying, and you're going to acquire more of that professional judgment as you gain experience. What I've given you here is a loose framework of some questions you can ask. I didn't give you rules. The loose framework. I'm going to do another brain dump where I talk about the advantages of a loose framework and professional judgment over a set of black and white rules, both in boundary surveying and as you set up organizations. My partner Brian and I are big fans of loose frameworks that allow for professional judgment rather than a set of black and white rules. I'll do another brain dump on that, but hopefully this will help our team members understand a little bit of the decision tree or the flow chart that we got to follow when we're trying to answer the question, do we go down the canyon wall to search for a monument at the corner? Good question. Not always an easy answer. Not always a right and wrong answer. Professional judgment is required. Thanks for listening.